Welcome back, everybody. Today we'll be discussing Rousseau's second treatise, part two. And as you can see from the very beginning, he starts off in a very lively manner. It's one of my favorite quotes of Rousseau, so I'll go ahead and read just from the very beginning of part two. This is on page 161, paragraph number 1. The first man who, having enclosed a piece of ground, to whom it occurred to say, "This is mine," and found people sufficiently simple to believe him, was the true founder of civil society. How many crimes, wars, murders, how many miseries and horrors mankind would have been spared by him who pulled up the stakes or filling in the ditch had cried out to his kind. Beware of listening to this impostor. You are lost if you forget that the fruits are everyone's and the earth's no one's. One of my favorite quotes from Rousseau. So what is he saying here? Look, the very beginning, the start of society in some ways is the start of private property, I should say, is a swindle. It's a action that somebody sort of takes from you, and it's not true justice. Whereas in Locke, if we remember when we read Locke, property is a natural right, and you can acquire as much as you want, and it's based on consent, and it's fine, and it's okay. You can accumulate as much as you want. But for Rousseau, this is a different question. He's really going to challenge this. There was once, I'll tell just an anecdotal story. There was once here in the offices, somebody who was stealing food from the fridge, and they put a big nasty note, please never take my food. And I put this very quote from Rousseau on the fridge. I said, beware of listening to this impostor. You are lost if you forget that the fruits are everyone's and the earth's no one's. They didn't like the note, they tore it down. But what that means in some ways is that you can't really possess anything permanently. And as we saw in the readings for today, Rousseau says that your labor, kind of like Locke, if you mix your labor, if you dig a ditch or dig a hole and put an acorn in there and watch the tree grow, in some ways you do have a certain right to it, but it's not a permanent right. It's only, as Rousseau will say, only until you can harvest the fruits, and then the earth kind of goes back to everybody. It's not something that you can take and accumulate in exorbitant large sums. That's not okay. So he gives, through paragraphs 1 through 6, kind of an account of how human beings began to sort of develop. And he talks about how there was lightning, a volcano, some happy accident acquainted them with fire, new resources. It's kind of something that happens by accident and chance. Human beings become more able to do these different things and to be able to cultivate the land, and they come into contact with one another. And he says these repeated interactions, paragraph 5, of the various beings with himself as well as with one another must naturally have engendered in man's mind perceptions of certain relations. So they can see how animals do things. They can imitate other animals, the idea of human perfectibility, and they can create things. They can create society. And this is what is going to be the cause of their miseries. Now, he talks about how agriculture tools, iron, these types of things made human beings, fire, allowed them to come together more and become more civilized. And I had you skip certain sections just because it was a little bit tedious to read, but there's some really interesting parts in sections that you didn't read, where he talks about the sweetest sentiments known to man of living together. Even though he says that it can be bad once we start coming together, there is something very sweet about life together, conjugal love, as he'll say. But this is not how we naturally were. We were naturally solitary, and we over time come together, and property develops over time. Property isn't something natural to human beings, especially the permanent right of property. Now, there's something else that I want to talk about, this concept of amour propre, which is love of oneself in the French. There's amour du soi-même, which is love of oneself, the proper self-love, and then amour propre is the vain or conceited self-love, the one that you, for this concept of amour propre, what it means for Rousseau is that it's a certain vanity. You're always comparing yourself to other human beings, and in order to be perceived, you want to be perceived a certain way rather than truly be who you really are. That's what's so dangerous about amour propre, is that it's always you're trying. It's like on Facebook, I think, or Twitter, or any of the Twit or whatever you guys use. the new messaging pictures, in some ways, it's all about envy, about looking a certain way, looking better than other human beings. You're always comparing yourself. And so Rousseau sees this as the root of all of our miseries, this conceited self-love that all of us have in some ways, and even Rousseau. And this, again, comes from closer interaction. He has, on paragraph 16, he talks about the first humans that started coming together. They were singing and dancing and amusing themselves around a tree. And he says that this, in some ways, was the first step at once towards inequality and vice. It's a really strange way to think about it. But what he means by that is because you compare yourself to other human beings, you want to be superior to them. From these first preferences arose vanity and contempt on the one hand, and shame and envy on the other. And the fermentation caused by these new leavens eventually produce compounds fatal to happiness and innocence. So not quite yet, it'll lead to that, but he sees the beginning of what will be this amour propre on modern society, how we're so envious and we want inequality in some ways. Now, he gives an account, and he says, like Hobbes and Locke and others, that he points to Native Americans. And he says, well, the stage that I'm talking about is kind of similar. So again, the people in the state of nature are prior to what you would say indigenous people around the world that came in contact in the 14 and 1500s. But he wants to say that there's something similar to it. And he wants to depict this time period as, and I'll just read from paragraph 18 in the middle of it on page 167. Thus, although men now had less endurance and natural pity had already undergone some attenuation, sort of weakening, this period in the development of human faculties occupying a just mean between the indolence of the primitive state and the petulant activity of amour propre. So you could say indigenous people in these times, in some ways, were happier than the very first human beings that are like animals and can't reason at all. And then modern times where we have amour propre and our vanity that's always active. He says, must have been the happiest and the most lasting epoch. The more one reflects on it, the more one finds that this state was the least subject to revolutions, the best for man, quite a statement, and that he must have left it only by some fatal accident, which for the sake of the common utility should never have occurred. An example of the savages, almost all of whom have been found at this point, so again, this is the model that he's sort of saying, seems to confirm that mankind was made always to remain in it, that this state is the genuine youth of the world, and that all subsequent progress has been so many steps in appearance toward the perfection of the individual and in effect towards the decrepitude of the species. So we think that moving forward from there has made society better and the individual better, but really it's really made society much worse. So again, this reminds us a little bit of Montaigne's essay on cannibals, right? In some ways, the cannibal's life is much better than civilized life. It's a critique of civilized life. Now, I would like to discuss as well some other very important sections. So section 30 is extremely important, 32, 33. And here he is arguing against Locke to a certain extent. And I'll read from paragraph 30. This is the third sentence. Besides, regardless of how they painted their usurpations, they realized well enough that they were only based on precarious and abusive right. This is the rich that are taking property. Sorry, I should read actually from paragraph 30, just from the start of paragraph 30. It is not possible that men should have not at last have reflected on such a miserable situation and on the calamities besetting them. The rich above all must soon have sensed how disadvantageous to them was a perpetual war of which they alone bore the full cost. So a little bit earlier that I skipped, in paragraph 27, there's kind of what you might say a state of war. So again, Rousseau, unlike Hobbes and Locke, has a very peaceful state of nature, but then it quickly devolves, not quickly, but after a while, it devolves into a state of war, just like Hobbes and Locke. So he follows that tradition. But what ends up happening is that for Locke, it's like, well, let's get together and we'll consent to a society and we'll leave the state of nature and we'll all be happy. But what Rousseau describes is basically the rich being worried about that their property is going to be taken from them. And so they arrange for this contract, the social contract, but it's not really consented by the weak or the poor. They're kind of swindled. They're tricked into it. And I want to read a little bit from this. And this is paragraph 31. To this end, after exhibiting to his neighbors the horror of a situation that armed all of them against one another, that made their possessions as burdensome to them as their needs, and in which no one found safety in either property or wealth, he easily invented specious reasons, so lies, to bring them around to this goal. And this is what Rousseau imagines the rich people, or those who have more power, telling the poor in order to build a political society. Let us unite, he told them, to protect the weak from oppression, restrain the ambitious, and secure for everyone the possession of what belongs to him. Let us institute rules of justice and peace to which all are obliged to conform, which favor no one, and which in a way make up for the vagaries of fortune by subjecting the powerful and the weak alike to mutual duties. Again, this kind of sounds like Locke. Let's build a society based on consent where nobody can take the fruits of everybody's labors. In a word, instead of turning our forces against one another, let us gather them into a supreme power that might govern us according to wise laws, protect and defend all the members of the association, repulse common enemies, and preserve an everlasting accord. And this sounds like Hobbes and Locke. Let's come together. Let's build a stable society away from the state of nature. And later on in paragraph 32, I'll skip a sentence. All ran toward their chains in the belief that they were securing their freedom. For while they had enough reason to sense the advantages of a political establishment, they had not enough experience to foresee its dangers. Those most capable of anticipating the abuses were precisely those who counted on profiting from them. And even the wise saw that they had to make up their mind to sacrifice one part of their freedom to preserve the other, as a wounded man has his arm cut off to save the rest of his body. So the rich could have continued to really abuse and take advantage of the weak, but they sort of realize they'll have to rein in a little bit, but they build the society where they will still be in power. And Rousseau says that it's this swindle, this tricked contract that allows them to establish slavery and inequality in a permanent way. Now you can see here, Rousseau is much more revolutionary. And this is the big difference from Locke, where he says the accumulation of wealth is legitimate and okay because you can help other human beings, whereas Rousseau really questions this. And you can see why Rousseau in many ways was so influential during the French Revolution. The French revolutionaries saw Rousseau as their philosopher, as somebody that showed how all of these inequalities, all of these things that were wrong with society were conventional and that they needed to kind of be torn down. And so there we have the great contrast between Rousseau and Locke. And to a certain extent, there's a little bit of truth on both sides, but it's hard to parse out. Again, the American experience follows more the Lockean experiment, but there are elements even within society today. They say, well, look, there are these great inequalities. We need to do something about it, and it's not natural. Whereas other people say, well, no, it's the free market. It's something that's been allowed and it's natural, and we've consented to it. So there you see the differences. Now, I'll end just briefly. It's a very dense essay, but you should really read to the end, and it's extremely important. But he talks about how society will ultimately come back to an extreme, to a new state of nature, you could say. And this is a state of inequality, a state where there is great inequality amongst human beings and no true freedom. And for many people reading this during the French Revolution or right before it, they saw this as the sort of arrival at the extreme state of nature, that the perverted state of nature, you could say, where everybody is unequal. And what Rousseau seems to suggest is that the only way to get out of it is to revolt, to do a revolution, to change it, to get out of this state of inequality. And he has some veiled references to the king. This is on paragraph 56, page 186. This is the second to last sentence. The uprising that finally strangles or dethrones a sultan is as lawful as action as those by which the day before he disposed of the subjects' lives and goods. Force alone maintains him, force alone overthrows him. Things thus proceed according to the natural order, and whatever may be the outcome of these brief and frequent revolutions, no one can complain of another's injustice, but only of his own imprudence or misfortune. So here you see the more revolutionary side. And he says, he's talking about a sultan in a far off land, but really I think he's talking about the king, and people, the French, the king, and people in France would have seen this and thought, look, his inequality or his his reign is based on convention and inequality, and it's against nature. And now we have the right to revolution and to fight back and to end their life. So again, it was very important for the French reading Rousseau. And I could go on and on about this beautiful essay. It's very dense and complex, but I'll leave it at that because I don't want to overwhelm you. If you have any questions, please let me know. I look forward to reading any of the essays on Rousseau.